My name is Jonathan Makiviti, and I am the Senior Campaigns Officer at SCIAF, which is the International Development Agency of the Catholic Church in Scotland. I'm going to kick things off this afternoon with an introduction to what the campaign is all about, and then I'm going to take you through step by step how you can get involved. After that, my colleague Anne Callahan, who is the Policy Officer at SCIAF, will tell us a bit more about the background of Scotland's Climate Justice Fund. She'll tell us a bit more about the policy background, and hopefully that will help you feel a bit more confident when you go and speak to your election candidates. We're joined tonight by a veteran of the Scottish Parliament, one of the original MSPs from the class of 1999. Ian Gray will give us some insider tips for the most effective ways to lobby our local representatives. He too will then answer any questions that you've got from the chat box. So in a nutshell, what is it that we mean specifically when we say that we're campaigning for climate justice? Well, people in the poorest countries around the world are carrying the heaviest burden of the climate emergency. For so many, climate change isn't a threat in the future, possibly affecting their children or their grandchildren. It's already an emergency right now. And we want the next Scottish Government to make climate justice a priority and help those hardest hit by significantly investing in the budget for the Scotland's Climate Justice Fund. A wide range of groups have already got behind this demand, including Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, which is a broad coalition of organisations in Scotland campaigning together on climate change. This includes trade unions, faith-based organisations, and environmental and international NGOs. Many of these organisations have published their own manifestos for the Scottish Parliament election campaign, but one of the common themes among many of them was this demand for more cash support from Scotland to help the hardest hit around the world. And we've launched this push for public pressure now because there's a really good opportunity for us to make an impact in 2021. Over the last 5 years, the Scottish Parliament has set quite ambitious targets to drastically cut our emissions by 2030. So the targets are there, but now we need to see action. And that action really needs to start from day one of the next Scottish Parliament. The parties are in the final stages of putting their manifestos together right now. And these manifestos will be setting the political agenda for the next 5 years. So this is the crucial time period when all of the parties are in listening mode. And finally, don't underestimate the importance of COP26, the global climate summit, which is coming to Glasgow this year. Something which I think unites all the different parties in Scotland is that they share this preoccupation with how they are perceived by those outside Scotland. So just as you can be sure that Glasgow City Council will clean up the streets to show off its best face when COP comes to town, the Scottish Government will want to set a good example too. And so this is a chance for Scotland to show leadership on climate justice and persuade other rich nations to do the same. So for all of those reasons, this is a really important window when we can make change happen, and we need all of us to make our voices heard. So there are three main ways that you can take action. We're asking you to share, show and shout for climate justice. First of all, share the message. This is about raising awareness of the demands by sharing the video clip on social media. Secondly, show you care. This is about posting your own message and campaign selfie on social media. And thirdly, shout out loud. This is about contacting your local election candidate, asking where they stand on justice. We've put together a supporter toolkit which takes you through each of these three ways to take action, and we'll pop a link to that in the chat box now so that you can download it. But I'll also email a copy to everyone who's registered for this training event just to make sure that you get it. And the first thing was share the message. So you can share the video from the SCCS YouTube channel, and we'll post a link to that in the chat box as well just now. And it's really important that you tag in the party leaders so that you can let them know that this is an issue which lots of people will be thinking about when it comes to deciding how to vote next month. You can tag the party leaders on Twitter and Instagram, and you'll see the handles that they use on your screen now. I think it's safe to say that they probably have turned off the notifications on their phones, but I think the more people that are tagging them, the more likely that they're going to actually see and end up watching the video. And the next thing is show you care. So obviously at the moment we can't march for climate justice, but that we can still show that we care. So we're asking you to join an online rally by taking a photo outdoors in a place where you go normally to get fresh air during lockdown. That could obviously be your garden, your local park, or if you're lucky enough, like Rab here, you might live near a beach. So just hold up your message calling for Scotland to act on climate justice. You can use scrap paper or even nature itself to send a message. And please use the hashtag Climate Justice Scot so that we can keep track of your messages. And the last of the 3 things that we'd like you to do is shout out loud by taking our demand for climate justice directly to your local election candidates. As I was saying earlier, this is a moment when all the parties are in listening mode. They are putting the finishing touches to their manifestos, which will set the agenda for the next 5 years of the Parliament. So we think that you can make a difference by contacting one or more of your local candidates to talk about climate justice. And even a 15-minute conversation can go a long way. This is not a normal election campaign, and local candidates can't go around knocking doors or holding street stalls as they would usually do. So there are very few opportunities for them to actually directly engage with potential voters. If even just a few candidates are persuaded to contact their party headquarters or the party leaders to tell them that we need to do more to boost the Climate Justice Fund, it could be enough to tip that over the edge and ensure that it makes it into the manifesto or into a campaign announcement. Now, everyone has 2 votes in the Scottish Parliament election. Your first vote is for the person you want to represent you in the constituency, and your second vote is for the party you want to represent you on the regional list. That means that you have a lot of local candidates from various parties seeking to win your vote, and it's completely up to you how many of them you want to approach to ask for a meeting. For example, you might already have an existing relationship with one of your MSPs. Maybe you've spoken to them before. If that's the case and they're standing again in this election, then you might want to focus your effort on trying to get a conversation with them. Or maybe one of your candidates standing in your constituency or in the regional list holds a prominent position in the party. Maybe they're a cabinet or a shadow cabinet spokesperson, or they might be the leader or the deputy leader. As I said, it's up to you which candidates you want to approach and whether you contact a few of them or even just one. And I think there are 5 main steps to bear in mind when you go around, you go about seeking a meeting with them. First of all, you can find out who your local candidates are and find their contact details at whocanivotefor.co.uk. If you enter your postcode on this website, you get the option to see the names and email addresses for candidates in both your local constituency and in your region. And we'll pop that link into to that site in the chat box now for whocanivotefor.co.uk. Number 2, email your chosen candidate to ask for a quick chat with them about climate justice, and that can be over Zoom or any other video platform that they use. Candidates are crying out for ways to have face-to-face conversations with voters during this election, so I think it's a very good chance that you'll get a meeting with them. We have put together a template email for you that's in the supported toolkit, but you can use your own message as well if you prefer. Number 3, make a plan. I can't stress this part enough. You really don't need to be an expert on a policy to speak to a politician. In Anne's presentation in just a moment, she's going to tell you a bit about the background. So you'll already know more about the Climate Justice Fund than probably the majority of candidates. But it is worth thinking in advance about something specific that you want the candidate to do. The one key thing that they can go away and do after your conversations. So is that you're asking them to email the party manifesto writer or the party leader, or are you asking them to tweet out in support of climate justice? Number 4, let us know how you get on. You can email us at campaigns@skiaf.org.uk to let us know when you've scheduled your meeting, and don't forget to report back later on as well to let us know what the candidates had to say. And number 5, follow up. After the meeting, it's always helpful to send them a quick email to thank the person. It's a useful way to build a relationship for the next time, and also just to remind them of anything that they've agreed to do. If the candidate then goes on to get elected on the 6th of May, you can get in touch with them again afterwards, just to ask for an update on what they're going to be doing to promote climate justice in the next Parliament. So please remember, if you have any questions about how to take part or about contacting your local candidates, you can pop them into the chat box now and we'll come to them later. In the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Anne and she's going to dive a bit deeper into the policy background.
Okay, so we know that climate change is adversely affecting those who've done least to cause climate change. Millions are already having their lives impacted through increased floods, impacts on food shortages, kind of forced migration. So this is the reality at the moment. I think it's really important to kind of be quite as passionate as you can about sort of reinforcing that reality that kind of people are facing at the moment. So the climate emergency isn't something, as Jonathan said, that's the future, it's something that's happening sort of now. So here's one recent example. Mozambique, kind of 2 years ago, was devastated with a cyclone. Worst natural disaster in kind of 2 decades. It destroyed as much as kind of 50% of the crops, and 500 people were killed. So climate change is making more of these types of events happen more frequently and with greater intensity. So it's kind of deeply kind of troubling, and that's why climate finance is essential to help countries adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change that are happening now. And what we're starting to see is something, you know, equally invidious, really, which is countries like Mozambique are being effectively forced to take out sort of kind of more loans in order to kind of cover the damage that's been caused, which means money away from other essential budgets. So rich countries like the UK made promises in 2009, and this was kind of like a make or break promise, because kind of countries already adversely affected by climate change were willing to kind of walk away if this promise hadn't been made. So, you know, promises were made and they haven't been kept. So rich countries promised to commit 100 billion per year by 2022, those countries that are adversely affected by that, to help them mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. Oxfam sort of recently did a bit of a kind of shadow report looking at where climate finance got to, and it's almost at kind of 60 million, which is far short of that target. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll find that actually very little of that is actually going towards adaptation, and an even smaller sliver of that is going towards those countries, like small island states and kind of least developed countries that are already adversely impacted by that. So it's not going to the right places. It's not hitting the communities kind of most affected. So we really need to make sure that, you know, we, you know, make good on these kind of climate finance promises, and it reaches the people and communities that most need it. So the Climate Justice Fund is one of a world first. It's something for kind of Scotland to be kind of proud about. It was launched in 2012. A commitment of £3 million was made to a number of countries. So this was good. And then at the COP21, the kind of First Minister announced an upgrade to that commitment of £3 million a year to help communities in partner countries adapt and survive to the effects of climate change. But that's been frozen at £3 million since kind of 2015, but the impacts and the costs of climate change are only rising. So we think in this year of COP, the fact that kind of Glasgow is hosting, as Jonathan said, it's really a platform for Scotland to show greater leadership here. And in the face of cuts being proposed for 0.7, is actually kind of take a lead and actually increase the budget that the Climate Justice Fund has significantly from its £3 million a year. So Malawi, I'll skip over this very quickly. What's great about this project? Yes, kind of SCAF kind of help run it, but local communities are at the centre of this. It's led in large cases by women. There's income generation kind of parts to this kind of programme which make it kind of self-sustaining, and it's helped 50,000 people in southern Malawi to continue their lives more fruitfully. So what's really good is there has, as Jonathan said, there has been kind of cross-party support for the kind of Climate Justice Fund. That's great. You know, the SNP kind of then government has accepted their calls partly for an independent review on one part of the Climate Justice Fund, looking to align that with best practice. Scottish Labour have committed to a significant increase, whilst the other parties are kind of working on their manifestos. We're expecting the manifestos sort of imminently, so there's still a listening ear there. But even when the manifestos come out, I think it's really important to maybe have a bit of a read of them and see what commitments are being sort of made before you kind of, you know, get on the phone or have that conversation with your potential MSP. So we've lobbied all the kind of parties pushing for this additional commitment in the Climate Justice Fund, but we really need to kind of demonstrate that there is kind of public support for this. And we want to see it come from new sources of finance, so something like a climate emitter tax, which also kind of looks at sort of behaviour change, but as well as, you know, we're not taking budgets from one to another, but we're kind of investing in a collective future. So here's a couple of suggested questions. I think this gives you a kind of sense of where we're kind of coming from. So we want to kind of encourage party leaders to kind of make commitments on this. So Scotland has a historic responsibility as a rich nation. So we want them to commit to significantly increasing the Climate Justice Fund. Second suggested question is, because Glasgow's kind of hosting the COP, can you get your party leader to kind of make public statements calling for nations to keep their promises to poorer countries, and make that announcement that Scotland, if they're elected as government of Scotland, they will commit to significantly raising kind of climate justice fund. Can you get your party leader to commit to, calling for the COP to be as fully participatory as it needs to be? So we know that COP is going ahead in some form, but I think there is some kind of increasing concern about how equal the participation will be for partners from the global south, both, whether that be governments or particularly kind of civil society. And we've been in conversation with Scottish Government to kind of host a series of conversations with developing countries to kind of unpack some of the kind of climate finance issues, for example, amongst many. So can you ask your kind of potential candidate to kind of raise this, these potential conversations that are going to be happening? And how will they, if they're elected in the Scottish Parliament, how will they go about actually amplifying what some of the kind of content that comes out of those conversations are? So these are just some suggestions. And it's always important to kind of put it in your own words, but hopefully that gives you a kind of helpful primer.
So Francine is asking, should we be lobbying for the Scottish Government to show leadership by putting party politics aside and pledging to work together as an alliance? So that sounds like a good approach to me. I wonder, Jonathan or Anne, do you want to come in on that one?
Happy to come in. I think that's a really good suggestion, Francine. I think in times of kind of national emergency, you often sort of find parties finding collaborative ways to kind of work together. And in the face of the kind of COVID sort of emergency and how we build back better, however that works, I think there's a real case to be made for climate change to kind of rise above it, because it's not going to be something that we're going to achieve. We're going to achieve a lot, hopefully in the next 5 years, but this is something that actually kind of needs to, 10 years, 20 years, like have much more kind of ambitious vision for kind of transformation. So I think it's a good suggestion. And I think that's what we try and do with you in kind of lobbying kind of candidates and how we get them to interact with one another in the Parliament. I'd be interested in Ian's kind of thoughts kind of later on when it's his question.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, perhaps that's a good segue into Ian, just conscious of the time. So maybe we should pass on to Ian just now, and there'll be an opportunity for people to ask questions of Ian after his presentation.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm really pleased to be asked to do this for a couple of reasons. Having spent 20 odd years as a politician, I'm now retiring, so I'm thinking back over my life. And the key, I think, is that although I've been a politician for a while, prior to that, I worked for 12 years as a campaigner for Oxfam. So I've been in the position that those of you who are campaigning on climate justice just now are in now. I've been in that, although you have to go back quite a long way for that. I'm talking about the mid-80s now. So I'm pretty old school when it comes to these things. And I dug out my Bible for how to campaign effectively. This is it here. Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, first published in 1971. This isn't quite a first edition, but it's nearly a first edition. So it's gone around. So Alinsky was a community organizer in the States, did the kind of work that Obama did before he got into elected politics. And he wrote this book with Rules for Radicals. There's quite a lot of rules. So I've picked out 5 of Alinsky's rules and paraphrased them slightly for the circumstances in which you guys are going to find yourself. And I hope that allows me to say a couple of things about what I think would be effective in this campaign. So the first rule, Alinsky's first rule, and the first rule of campaigning is pick the target. And you'd be astonished how often professional campaigners run campaigns aimed at the wrong target. And by the wrong target, I mean a person or institution who don't actually have the power to deliver the objective of the campaign. So even if you convince them, you're not going to get what you want. So in this case, pick the target means you're really looking for people who are going to be elected to Parliament. So when Jonathan was talking about you've got a lot of candidates, certainly if you include all the regional list candidates, you are going to have to prioritise. So you should prioritise and you should think about which of those candidates are actually most likely to be in Parliament. So don't go for the one that you think might be most sympathetic to the arguments around climate change. Go for the one that you think might win locally. Now, who that is depends very much on your local situation. So have a think about who you want to prioritise. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the person that's currently your MSP, because you might find, for example, that the person, that there's another candidate who's probably going to come second or maybe even third in your constituency, but they're top of the regional list for their party. So actually, they're probably going to end up in the Parliament as well. So you have to do a bit of thinking about who it is you're going to prioritise, because you really want to try and get the arguments across to somebody who's going to be in a position to help deliver. And I'm sure whatever organisation you're part of would be able to help you if you're not sure which is the one that you ought to be prioritising. So that's rule one, pick the target. Rule two is this: power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. Sorry about the enemy language, Alinsky. That's the kind of language Alinsky used to use. And when you see some of the people he was campaigning against in those days, you can understand why. But power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. So listen, the reason you're campaigning at election time is because these candidates want your vote, but you're only one vote. So the important thing is that in all your dealings with the candidates, you make clear that you are speaking for a much bigger group of people. Make that group sound as big as you possibly can. So if you are a tier fund campaigner, talk about, local tier fund campaigners as if there were thousands of them. If you're a SCIAF campaigner and an activist in your local church, talk about the local church, because those candidates don't just want your vote, they want everybody's vote. Every candidate wants everybody's vote. So play up, leverage who you are and what organisation you're representing. So don't talk about yourself, talk about the coalition or the church or tier fund or SCIAF, whoever it is that you are campaigning with. So that's rule two. Rule three, whenever possible, go outside the expertise of your target. Well, look, you don't have to worry about that, because I think it was Jonathan who said this. You already know more about this campaign and the Scottish Climate Justice Fund than pretty well any of those candidates. So the point about this is you should be really confident about lobbying them, because just by watching the video and listening to Anne's presentation, by looking at the supporter toolkit, you know more about this than the person you're speaking to, and you should be confident that you do. That doesn't mean you need to bamboozle them with loads of statistics and stuff. Just be confident in yourself that you know more about it, and you probably care more about it as well, which is critical too. So that's three. Rule four is make the enemy live up to his own rhetoric, okay? And my interpretation of this is, don't you do all the talking. So if I'm a politician or a candidate and some pesky campaigner wants to meet me and they come to see me and I give them 15 minutes and they speak for 14 and a half minutes of that time, that's the easiest lobbying I've ever been subjected to, because all I have to do is sit there and listen and nod and look as if I'm interested. you need to try and get them talking about climate justice as well. You need to get them talking about climate change and the climate emergency too, because that's actually much more difficult for them, because then they have to tell you what they think. And when they tell you what they think, you need to push them through on that. So if they say, yes, I think climate change is the most important issue facing the world today, then you need to push them on that and say, well, this is what you have to do. If they say something like, well, I think this is very, very important, but the Scottish Parliament, you know, this is not a devolved power. Really, the Scottish Parliament needs to be focusing much more on health and education than the things it's responsible for. You can go back to them and say, yeah, but climate change is a devolved responsibility, and this is part of the Scottish Parliament's response to climate change. If they say, well, I'm a Conservative candidate and we've got a government I support in Westminster, and you know this is really a matter for them, you can say, but the Conservatives in the Scottish Parliament supported the creation of the Climate Justice Fund. And it's the government in Westminster that's bringing COP26 to Glasgow. Surely they want the Scottish Parliament working and the Scottish government working with them to set a good example. So by listening, making them tell you what they think, you can find a way into their arguments. Make them live up to their own rhetoric. And the last of Alinsky's rules that I was going to talk about tonight is the fifth one. And that is, the price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. And all that really means is be really sure and prepared. And Jonathan said this already, actually. When the candidate says to you, what do you want me to do? You need to have the answer. And it needs to be something really straightforward that they can do. Now, I think the first thing you want to ask them to do is something that they can do right now as a candidate. And in the supporters toolkit, it talks about asking them to tweet or to put on their Facebook page the video that you've seen with support for the campaign. That's a really difficult for them thing for them to say no to. I mean, if they've been, you know, working through the meeting with you, being very supportive, and then you ask them to do that, it's very hard for them to say no. So ask them to do that. If you want to talk about what they can do when they're elected, then yes, talk to them about increasing the Climate Justice Fund. But that's not something a single MSP can do. So say to them, would you be willing to put a motion down supporting an increase in the fund? Would you be willing to ask a question? If you're elected and I come back and ask you, will you ask a question? Get them to commit to something very, very specific that you can follow up on. So you've got a really hard answer to the question, what do you want me to do? So that's the 5 rules that I picked from Alinsky that I think can make this a really effective meeting for you. And my last rule is not an Alinsky's rule. This is my rule. So my rule, this is Ian's rule of campaigning, and that is be nice, okay? You feel really passionately about this, and that's right, and you need to show you care, but don't go in all guns blazing. And just a very quick story from my Oxfam days, why this matters. Way back in the 80s, one of the things we were campaigning for was the forgiveness of third world debt. And at the time, that was considered an absolutely outrageous demand. Politicians thought if you forgave debt, then the world would come to an end. People would just borrow and they would never have to pay it back, so they wouldn't care. So one of the things that we did is exactly what you were doing. We got people to go to their MPs and to try and explain to them why this would be a worthwhile thing to do. And one of the Oxfam activists who did that used to go and see quite regularly their local MP, who was a guy called Ken Clarke, and talk to him about this. And Ken Clarke was a Tory, of course. And this started in the days of the Thatcher government. And the answer he gave was, look, you can't just forgive debt. People have to pay back things that they borrow. That's the way the world is. But they kept working and they liked him and they were nice to him. And what they didn't know, as it turned out, was that Ken Clarke's wife actually worked in an Oxfam shop. She was an Oxfam volunteer. And what they also didn't know was a few years later, Ken Clarke would be Chancellor of the Exchequer. And by that time, they had won the argument with Ken Clarke. And that was a big part of policy changing and debt being forgiven. So just be nice to people, even if they don't agree with you at the start, because you never know where it might lead. My wife always says you catch more bees with honey, and that's a decent rule for campaigning as well.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Ian. That's really, really helpful, really insightful and interesting as well. And a good point at the end there about debt. Yeah, of course, that's something that we've kind of seen in climate change over the years. I think when you start talking about, how much we need to reduce our carbon emissions by, and the levels that we are at now were unthinkable and would be, people were getting laughed out the door for going with them now. But because of the public pressure that there has been on the climate issue, then things which seemed unfeasible are now both feasible and necessary, and we need to go even further as well. I would be really keen for people to ask questions of Ian, and if we can just hold on to you for a few more minutes, Ian. I know you want to go and get your tea, as we all do. But there's no questions just now, but if people want to put them in, that would be great. But maybe I would just ask Ian, a question from me first. It's about the timing. So parties haven't published their manifestos yet, but we expect them, very soon. How much of an opportunity do you think there is now to still influence those manifestos, even though they should still be at quite a late stage?
So I think it's quite tight, if I'm honest. I mean, the reason that you don't know the dates for sure when the manifestos will be published is that the parties actually talk to each other about when their manifestos will be published, so that they don't. Two of the major parties don't publish on the same day. There's a bit of a gentle person's agreement that, each party gets a day and they get a kind of free run at it. But it doesn't mean they've not been written, but they will be at a very late stage. So if I'm honest, Ben, it is getting quite late for that. But what activists should understand is that the coalition has been campaigning for some time now to have this included in manifestos, and so it's still worth doing, because there will be a final stage. I mean, manifestos get printed like the day before they're actually launched, and they do tend, certainly in the Labour Party, they get changed right up to the last minute. So it's late in the day, but it's not too late to try and exert some pressure on that.
Brilliant indeed. Yeah, no, thanks. And yeah, as you said, this is something that we have been kind of pushing for quite some time, and certainly as a coalition, I've spoken to all of the manifesto leads and many politicians within the parties as well already about that. But also that this is an issue which should continue all the way to COP. So if, in a sense, if there isn't included in the manifestos, then there's still this big opportunity in the horizon when we can be calling for the next Scottish Government, in a sense, to bring this forward around the COP26 conference. A question's just come in from Andrew. So Andrew's asking, any tips for engaging with candidates or MSPs who don't already have a strong interest in either climate change or international justice issues? How would you approach that?
Well, I think it depends. It depends whether they don't have an interest in the sense that they've not been particularly engaged with it, or whether they're actually, even if it's quite politely, kind of antagonistic to climate change as a priority. I mean, I think if you have a candidate who, and this is probably the more likely one, if you have a candidate who is not particularly experienced candidate, maybe quite new to politics, maybe never really thought all that much about climate change before, I think the way into it is probably to talk about, well, the first thing is I would certainly start with climate change rather than international justice, because it's much more likely that they'll have some awareness of what a big issue climate change is. I think that it probably then comes back to that rule I was saying about what they think you have. So you need to try and find a way, it's not aggressive, but a way of getting across that it's not just you who's asking about this, it's you know, lots of activists locally. It's your church. It's these organisations like Oxfam and Skiaf, which the candidate will have heard of. If you are a young activist, then I think I would, you know, play that card as well. You know, you understand that for most young people, this is the biggest issue of the day. That's true, and I think it's fair to say it. So I think you have to try and get across that, even if they're not very interested in it, a lot of people whose votes they're looking for really are.
Brilliant. No, that's great. Thanks very much, Ian. Just checking if there's any other. There's another question just come in from Arthur. Do you have any tips for dealing with a candidate who asks a question about getting more detail on a particular issue, but you might not have all the details?
Well, the tip's the really obvious one. Don't try and pretend that you do or bumble your way through. Be honest and say, and so the tip to the politician would be the same thing as well. Be honest, say, I don't know that, but I will find out. How can I get in touch with you? You know, have you got an email address, and I'll email that to you. And then it's a case of going back to the coalition or one of the constituent organisations and asking the question. I'm sure Jonathan will have loads of people who could give you the information. But I think the biggest thing is to be quite honest and say, well, that's a good question and I don't actually know the answer, but I will find out for you.
Brilliant, thanks. Yeah, that's right. And anyone here on the call tonight going and having these conversations, you know, do come to Jonathan, myself, or any of the other sort of people working for the charities that have brought you along tonight, and we will be happy to get in touch. So there's just one more question. Maybe Ian, I'll just hold you on for one more question, but I might need to ask Catherine to ask that yourself. Yeah. Catherine, is that okay?
What, me?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, you just popped the question in the chat. Would you be able to?
Of course. Sometimes there are many Catherines at the group meetings.
Ah, of course, sorry.
And we don't know which one, and I can't see how many. So yeah, I was very impressed with Ian's 6 ideas, 6 points, because actually I'd already written out a similar thing, but mine was to contact, it's actually not MSP candidates, but councillors who are making decisions on the ground about how the actual environment in Scotland is constructed or deconstructed, because there's been a very upsurge in building on green land in Glasgow and surrounding areas. That it seems to have become overwhelming with private companies, and that it seems nothing we can do about it. Of course, I'm very concerned with the international issues, but because we are in Scotland, you know, it's good to be able to have some way of, you know, contacting the councillors who, as far as I know, don't even speak to you if you're not a constituent of theirs. But I mean, Scotland belongs to everyone. The world belongs to everyone. So, you know, there's no dividing line between this and that. And at the end of the day, the Tory politicians, they just want to make money. They actually see climate, the climate emergency as a way of making money. They can't stop their brain being on that way of operating. They can't just switch off and become Greenpeace people. You know, they're into making money. And my question to you actually was, I know I've said a lot about how do you get to councillors to get them to try and change, affect them. The other second question is, how do you lobby your MSP candidate? So there's actually 2 questions for Ian, and I was very impressed with his 6 points, which I've written down. Thank you, Ian.
So I think the coalition itself has in the past focused campaigns on local councillors because that requirement for local action and a local perspective to address climate change, I think, is pretty well understood. You should be able to get to local councillors because they should all either hold regular surgeries, which you can turn up at, or have an email or a contact number, which will be on the council website, whereby you can arrange meetings in the same way as we're talking about here. So they really should be accessible. I mean, I don't know what the situation is in Glasgow, but certainly where I am in East Lothian, you would be able to see all of them. You wouldn't be able to lobby a councillor for an area that you don't live in, but that's really the kind of protocols, and MSP protocols are the same. So when Parliament was sitting and I was an MSP, the rules didn't really allow me to do casework for another MSP's constituents. So, you know, there are some rules which people may appear to be being difficult, but actually they are abiding by the rules. But you certainly should be able to meet with local councillors. The issue you raise obviously is a different one from the Climate Justice Fund, but it's an interesting one because that aspect of the way in which we build and treat the green belt in our own towns and communities is quite driven by government, in fact. So here in East Lothian, for example, it's a perennial problem for us. I know it's not a city, but you know, where development takes place and the nature of it is a constant difficulty, and that is often because developers have the right of appeal to ministers who overturn local decisions to try and stop developers. So it's a bit off this specific campaign, but it's something that's worth talking to MSP candidates about, because it is something they will be dealing with in Parliament. In terms of lobbying MSP candidates, I think, you know, the 5 ways of approaching them that Jonathan had at the start was absolutely spot on. And somebody's asking what's the best way of getting a busy candidate's attention. I mean, I would say 2 things to that. 3 things. Jonathan has indicated how you do it through, they will have an email address, they'll be on social media, and so there should be a way of contacting them. Candidates are a lot less busy in this election than they usually are, because normally they would be out knocking doors and they can't do that. So they're delivering leaflets, which is fine, but they would rather be talking to candidates. So that shouldn't be a problem in this election. And the other thing I would say is, if a candidate is too busy to talk to a potential voter, then I would hope their political future is pretty limited anyway. They really should. But it also goes back to trying to get across to them that you're not a lone voice. You're speaking for a lot of people on this issue.
Brilliant. No, that's great. Thanks so much, Ian. Jonathan, can I just pass back to you?
Yes, and thanks very much, Ian. I actually, while you were speaking there, I found a copy of the Alinsky's book on my bookshelf, which I haven't read, which I don't need to now because you've very helpfully summarised it, and I hope that in your retirement you might think about writing the sequel. So thanks very much for joining us tonight, and yeah, it's been great. It's been great to hear your insights. But thanks very much. I had originally planned to go into breakout rooms so we could have some small group discussion, but unfortunately I had some tech issues with the Zoom account, so we're not going to be doing that. But we had a really good question and answer session there with Ian that we let run on a little bit anyway. What I will do, though, just now is just recap over the 5 steps to take to go about setting up a meeting with your MSP candidate. So I'll share my screen again. Okay, so step 1 was how to find out who your local candidates are and their contact details. If you go to that website, whocanivotefor.co.uk, you can find the candidates in your constituency and in your region, and you'll have the social media contact details and the email address for all of them. Step 2, ask them to set up a meeting on Zoom. Now, there's a template email that you can use in the Supporter Toolkit, which will email out to you. Step 3, make a plan. Now, so this is about what specific ask are you going to ask them to do. So think about some of the questions, which is the suggested questions, which Anne mentioned during her presentation. or the suggested questions in the supporter toolkit which you can use. Number 4 was let us know how you get on. So please email campaigns@skiaf.org.uk to let us know who you've managed to set up a meeting with, and afterwards how you get on with it. And number 5, follow up after the call. So it's really, really important that you just send a quick email just to thank the candidate for giving them for giving you some of their time. But it also means that it's easier to speak to them again in the future, because if, as Ian said, if you prioritise someone who you think has a good chance of being elected as an MSP, it means that you've got an opening there to keep ensuring that this issue is on the agenda when they're in the Parliament. So some other ways to get involved in this election: the Stop Climate Chaos Scotland has launched an election calendar, which has a hustings calendar and other meet the candidate events. We've also got lots of resources to help you ask the climate question and campaign for action for our next group of MSPs. And you can find all of that on the SCCS website, and the address there is on your screen, and someone might be able to put it in the chat box so you can copy and paste it as well. Thanks again for your time tonight, and please do go off and speak to your local candidates and let us know how you get on.